refugees. However, there's no links in our funds with respect to the use of the funds for refugees. So we will revise that. And then there's one more comment I'd like to make. I'm rather surprised when I hear the UKIP representatives talk about the need for European funds. Now, I know that you come from a less well-developed region where you've suffered closures, pit closures, amongst other things, but I'd be very pleased to meet together with you to show the citizens in the UK just how cohesion policy has contributed to retraining and creation of new jobs and huge changes in that region that's been so affected. Solidarity, that's very important, and the need for united Europe. Only that will be able to contribute to consolidation of the Union. Thank you. And I'm sure we'll continue to have this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Colleagues, the debate is closed. We vote today at 12 a motion for a resolution which I received to wind up this debate. We move now quickly to the next item on the agenda, debates on cases of breaches of human rights, democracy and the rule of law. And the first item is human rights situation in Crimea, in particular of Crimean Tatars. I open the debate by giving the floor to the authors. I start with Mr. Butikov. 1 minute.
Thank you, President. Dear colleagues, I think it is fitting and adequate that this Parliament comes together in a joint resolution to highlight the human rights situation in occupied Crimean territories. In particular, the Crimean Tatars have been persecuted from the very beginning of the Russian invasion. Their elected representatives have been prohibited on fulfilling their elected duties as they would have been supposed to do under the Ukrainian law. In fact, what Russia has been pursuing is a course of repressing Crimean Tatars because there is a very broadly expressed mistrust over this part of the population. We think that it is very important that the European Parliament express its solidarity, and we're happy that we can share that together.
Thank you. Madam Fotyga, 1 minute and a half.
Dziękuję. 2 lata temu. Thank you, President. 2 years ago, a multinational group of MEPs of the NATO Parliamentary Association traveled to Kiev, to the Verkhovna Rada, and there was Federica Mogherini among them. The president back then was Yanukovych. The Maidan would happen in several days, and the annexation of Crimea in several weeks. At night, I was at the Maidan. I watched the barricades. I looked at the faces of Berkut. I looked at the places where the snipers hit the first victims. I talked to the ordinary citizens, and I am convinced that it's the will of the ordinary citizen that decided what would happen in Ukraine, and that is the will of the people that will lead Ukraine to change despite all the difficulties. We owe them solidarity. I would like to remind you about the policy of non-recognition of the annexation of Crimea. Putin tries to operate in such a way as to limit our solidarity, and if we change our approach, that would be a sign of weakness on our part. That's why I would like to appeal to everybody to adopt this resolution. Thank you.
Grazie. Thank you. The violation of human rights in Crimea have significantly increased since the illegal annexation and occupation of the peninsula by Russia. Various international organizations have reported on a large number of violations against the Tatar community. Most of them have rejected the Russian occupation and they boycotted the so-called referendum of March. These abuses include forced disappearances, torture and extrajudicial crimes that the authorities are not pursuing. Those who've been able to refuse taking on Russian nationality are subject to huge discrimination. The Tatars have been silenced, the media being silenced, journalists are having to escape from the Crimea for fear of their lives. We denounce this situation. It should come to an end as soon as possible.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, Mr. Preda, 1 minute.
Thank you very much, President. Well, I'd like to say that I'm very pleased that finally we have an opportunity to discuss the issue of Crimea. My political group has tried for 6 months now to try and get this discussion on Crimea on Parliament's agenda. I have to say that the other political groups were against that. The only group who supported us was the ECR group up to this month. And the reason for this is the ambiguous attitude to Russia and the occupation of the Crimea. An important political group in Parliament is asking for us to go on in an official delegation to Moscow. I think that is absolutely unacceptable until all our colleagues who are on the blacklist of the Kremlin have been removed. And until Russia leaves the Crimea, we can't normalise relations unless those conditions are imposed.
Thank you, Madam President. In Crimea, we're seeing how geopolitical interests trump what the people want and the life of the people. We're very worried about the situation of people there, and that's not going to be resolved while there's still a embargo. So I think it's time to lift the embargo so as to prevent the drama that the civil population are suffering deteriorating. We're particularly worried about human rights violations and the situation of the Tatar community, as well as the situation of other ethnic minorities in this conflict. The rights of indigenous peoples must be respected in Crimea as well as anywhere else in the world. Therefore, we need proper negotiations under the aegis of the UN, and we also need to create the conditions that would allow humanitarian assistance organizations, human rights organizations and journalists to have access to them. They have to be able to act while this conflict is resolved.
Last speaker on authors list, Mr. Ostrovicius, 1 minute.
Madam Chair, colleagues, Russia's President Vladimir Putin, in his recent interview to the German Bild, said the following, I quote, "The nationalist coup in the Ukrainian capital of Kiev in February 2014 has hugely scared 2.5 million Russian people living on Crimea. So what did we do? We have not gone to war, we have not fired, not a single person was killed." End of quote. President Putin, you keep lying to the whole world. As a chief commander of your little, polite and green man, you bear your personal responsibility for those who disappeared or were murdered since 2014 in Crimea. Let me read the following names of Crimean Tatars who lost their lives. Reshat Ametov, Timur Shaymardanov, Seyran Zinedinov, Islam Jeparov, Jevdet Islamov, Eskander Absalamov, Ruslan Ganiyev, Arlen Terechov. The list is not complete. Colleagues, let's not repeat the mistakes of the 20th century. Let's call things the right names. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, on behalf of political groups, first speaker, Mr. Plenković, 1 minute.
Thank you, Chair. Our resolution supports the clear choice of Ukraine to pursue the European path and draws again the attention of the international community to the severe breaches of human rights on illegally annexed Crimea by Russia. We strongly support Crimean Tatars as indigenous people who face discrimination and abuses because of their opposition to the occupying authorities. The European Union must continue its policy of non-recognition of annexation and keep the related sanctions against Russia. If Russian authorities want to improve their relations with the European Union, they should withdraw from Crimea and allow Ukraine to re-establish control over its territory. It is vital that the international organisations, human rights NGOs and media have unimpeded access to Crimea and that their presence is coordinated with the Ukrainian authorities. Therefore, I welcome the mission of the Special Representative for Human Rights of the Secretary-General of the Council of Europe. Also, I support the proposed Geneva Plus format and believe that the question of Crimea's return to Ukraine and efforts to stop the conflict in the east, Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, should not be decoupled, because we know that the causes of these two problems are the same. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sani, 1 minute.
Thank you, President. I'd like to make it clear in this Parliament that all political forces in this Parliament wish to solve the problems in the Crimea. And of course, what we need to do is for Putin to finish these atrocities against the inhabitants of the Crimea, including the Tatar minority. The endeavours that we see in this Parliament, which undermine our solidarity, actually help Putin. These endeavours are a gift for Putin. So whatever undermines our unity serves the interests of Putin, and that is why I'd like to ask all colleagues to stick with the sanctions against Russia and do not undermine these sanctions for ulterior motives. Undermining European unity would be the gravest mistake.
Ms. Maka, 1 minute.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you've ever been to the Crimea in better times, you know that it was a region with a vibrant tourist sector, a beautiful mosaic of different languages and cultures and traditions. I was there travelling around just a few months before it was annexed by Russia. It's a jewel on the Black Sea, but it's now become a peninsula of fear. Since the illegal annexation, the methods of Putin's Russia have been applied there without any scruples, and we know what that means for the situation of human rights. The position of the authorities basically comes down to keep quiet, like it or lump it. Dissident voices are repressed and persecuted. Journalists and pro-Ukrainian activists are fair game. And the Tatar communities are being targeted especially. Their media are being gagged. The mosques and cultural centres are considered troublesome, and they're object of abduction, murder and torture. This is outrageous. History is repeating itself for this proud people, and the international community is starting to wake up to this, and delegation of the Council of Europe is not come a day too soon. We need Russia on board for the final conclusion.
1 minute.
Thank you. Põhjus, miks Venemaa Krimmi tatarlasi kiusab või
The reason why the Russian Federation is interested in suppressing the freedom of speech of the Crimean Tatars is because the majority of them are very critical towards the Russian authorities. During the Crimean referendum, the Crimean Tatars were very active. They were protesting in the streets against the referendum, carrying Ukrainian flags. They haven't forgotten the persecution and deportations by the Soviets in 1944. The situation of the Tatars has gone worse. They can't learn their own language in the school. The TV channels have been shut down, and people who do not wish to have Russian citizenship are finding it difficult to find school places or even jobs. But by persecuting the Crimean Tatars, their human rights are not only violated, but also it endangers their language and cultural heritage. Russia has the obligation to make sure that the Tatars can live in their historical homeland and preserve their culture and language.
So, Mr. Štětina, 1 minute.
Děkuji za slovo. Dámy a pánové.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the right for education in the Tatar language and the Ukrainian language is not respected in Crimea. The number of Tatar schools is being reduced. The freedom of speech is under threat. Some Tatar media were closed down by force. Cultural and symbolic elements of the Tatar identity are being suppressed. We should condemn the intimidation of Tatar political leaders. This also applies to Mustafa Jamiliev, who has been for a long time pointing out the desire of the Russian Federation to occupy Crimea. Let me remind you that Mustafa in 1968 was sentenced for 3 years in the USSR for criticizing the occupation of my country, Czechoslovakia. His prosecution by the Crimean occupational bodies for the crimes under a Russian penal code is unacceptable, whilst Crimea is still considered to be Ukrainian territory. Crimean Tatars deserve our support.
1 minute.
Thank you. The 2 million people living in Crimea are facing unprecedented levels of human rights abuses. And for the Tatar community in Crimea, like all who have categorically opposed the illegal occupation and annexation of Crimea, this means systematic persecution, intimidation, expulsion, abduction, violent attacks, torture and death with no legal redress. It also means that the local population has no access to international bodies whom all the people of Europe can turn to when their rights are being violated. We stand in solidarity with the Melis, the entire Crimean Tatar community, as well as with all Ukrainians who are in a vulnerable position for openly supporting the territorial integrity of Ukraine. I call on the Russian Federation and the de facto authorities in Crimea to grant unimpeded access for the independent experts of the UN, Council of Europe, OSCE and the High Commissioner on National Minorities. Thank you.
And Mr. Tannock, 1 minute.
Madam President, following Russia's forceful and illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014, the peninsula's Tatar population and Ukrainian minority have suffered a marked deterioration in civil and political liberties and other fundamental human rights. The Tatars' very principled boycott of the imposed regime's 2014 bogus referendum on Russian rule has exacerbated the historical enmity between Crimean Tatars and Moscow, dating right back to Stalin's brutal program of Tatar deportation in the 1940s. Consequently, Tatar political leaders have been exiled, media outlets suppressed, and the Tatar public commemorations prohibited. Reports suggest that unlawful arrest and detention are becoming increasingly commonplace in the peninsula. The human rights situation in Crimea therefore remains extremely troubling. I unequivocally condemn Russia's annexation of Crimea, which legally still belongs to Ukraine, and urge the de facto authorities to respect the fundamental tenets of human rights in their dealings with the Tatars. The EU and the international community is watching very closely. Thank you.
And last speaker, Mr. Synadinos.
Madam President, the European Union has given its views on individual countries and on their authorities, but it's also really being run by individual countries, for example Germany. I think that we have been hypocritical about this kind of area, particularly since, if you look at the restriction on people's freedoms in Istanbul, for example, or Constantinople, there people are not able to go about their business. And we overlook certain things. We do not see the continuing occupation of Cyprus, for example. We pay less than sufficient attention to other countries which are allowing migrants to come in large numbers into European territory. And now the Tatars, of course, for 20 years now, there has been a process between the Tatars and a kind of conflict, an ongoing conflict with Russia. And we should not be selective in our indignation. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. Now, for the catch-the-eye procedure, even if I have a long list, we have only 2 minutes, so I'll take just 2 speakers. First is Mr. Pospel.
předsedkyně. Já jsem rád.
Thank you, President. I'm very pleased that I can talk about this topic and say something that Mr. Štětina has already mentioned. I am a Czech person and I am extremely pleased that Mr. Mustafa Džemiliev back in 1968 protested against the occupation of Czechoslovakia, and that we can support this nation that has been repressed during the 20th century in the Soviet Union, and now it is being repressed by Russia. I'm really pleased that we are calling upon Russia today to stop this intimidation of Tatars and to respect the human rights. There are Tatar media that are being repressed, intimidated, Tatars that are being missing. There are about 20,000 Tatars that left Crimea last year due to this pressure. They left Crimea to go to Ukraine, so Tatars are leaving their homes again. We cannot accept it. We should immediately press upon Russia and always talk about this topic. Thank you.
Dobrze, że dzisiaj tutaj w Strasburgu słychać.
I'm very happy to see that today in Strasbourg we are speaking and we hear the voice of Crimean Tatars. This small country and its situation is a very clear sign of the consequences of the Russian annexation of Crimea. I'm very sad to hear that we're not talking about the things that really depend on ourselves, on our decisions. Yesterday we had a debate on the European Council meeting, and in the statement of the President of the European Council we didn't hear virtually no word was spoken about Crimea, the Minsk agreement and the very serious threat of aggressive steps that may be undertaken by Russia and pro-Russian forces. Finally, we had actually not a word about Nord Stream 2. This project turns into nothing and annihilates the results of our sanctions with respect to Russia. It is a proof of the fact that we are not really reacting strongly. We should be reacting where we can really actually react.
Commissioner, do you have a point of order, Mr. Bütikofer?
President, I asked for the opportunity to react to a personal attack, and I would like you to take note of this. In my remarks, I welcomed that six political groups came together for a commonly proposed resolution, and indeed this discussion showed that we are united. I regret, therefore, that Mr. Preda used his speaking time as a co-author to attack other colleagues, including me. He said that those who did not support EPP proposals earlier are showing an ambiguous attitude towards Russian occupation of Crimea. I think this is untrue, insulting, unjust and splittist, and I strongly reject that accusation.
It's based on Article 164, so it's noted. Madam Commissioner, you have the floor.
Madam la President, honorable members, almost 2 years have passed since the illegal annexation of Crimea and Sevastopol by the Russian Federation, which the European Union does not recognize and continues to condemn. In addition to being a grave violation of international law, the illegal annexation has had a serious negative impact on the human rights situation. Systematic curtailment of the residents' basic human rights and fundamental freedoms is an emblematic feature of the current situation in the peninsula. Imposition of Russian laws and citizenship has created a situation of legal uncertainty and discrimination. The Crimean Tatar community and other residents supporting the territorial integrity of Ukraine are paying a particular high price for the views they express. Public events in Simferopol to commemorate the 1944 deportation have not been allowed. Tatar media outlets have been closed, and Mejlis, a self-governing body of Crimean Tatars, and its activists have been prosecuted. The appalling cases of enforced disappearances, torture and killings of young Crimean Tatars have not been properly investigated so far. High Representative Mogherini discussed these cases when she met in person the representative of families of Crimean Tatars in Ukraine in November 2015. Let me also stress the EU's concern over the detention and sentences of Oleg Sentsov and Alexander Kolchenko. Their case, which the EU has monitored, is in breach of international law and elementary standards of justice. The EU will remain vocal in demanding their immediate release and safe return to Ukraine. Finally, the EU has repeatedly called for full, free and unrestricted access for international human rights actors to the whole territory of Ukraine, including Crimea and Sevastopol. We welcome those missions which have taken place so far. The mission of the Council of Europe's Commissioner for Human Rights, Nils Muiznieks, in autumn 2014, the unofficial mission of Turkish prominent persons in spring 2015, and the continued work of the non-governmental Crimean Human Rights Field Mission. We also praise the efforts of the UN and OSCE, autonomous institutions, which have so far been denied access to the peninsula but document human rights abuses using a wide variety of sources. We very much hope that the most recent mission, dispatched by the Secretary General of the Council of Europe last week and headed by Ambassador Gerald Studman, will pave the way for improved human rights situation in the Crimean Peninsula. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner. Colleagues, I have received 7 motions for resolutions to end up this debate. The debate is closed and we vote today at 12. We move to the next one, which is Bahrain, the case of Mohammed Ramadan. We open with the list of speakers who are also authors. First speaker is Mr. Smith. 2 minutes.
President, thank you. There's been a genuinely good cooperation across the House in the production of this really very solid resolution, and bluntly, I'd hope so. If we can't unite on something like an opposition to the death penalty, I don't think there's much hope for us. There are those in Bahrain who do feel that we focus too much upon the kingdom, we criticise too much the lack of progress in Bahrain that we've seen in parts, and there's other abuses in the region. Why not focus upon them? And firstly, we do focus on other abuses in the neighbouring countries, in the wider region. And secondly, in many ways it is a compliment, because there is a feeling within this House that there is scope for a dialogue with Bahrain that's actually going somewhere. There is actually a process towards reform that we can assist, and there is useful discussions to be had. And it is important that we recognise the progress that Bahrain has made in a reform programme. The institutional reform, we've seen steps towards an independent judiciary, we've seen the establishment of ombudsmen, we've seen the establishment of the Prisoners' Rights Commission, a special investigations unit. There has been a number of declarations which have been really very positive. But that progress has stalled, and we need to see that progress continue. And we can assist in that process by being vocal in our criticism, but also constructive in our willingness to help.